I'd like to hear more from your perspective as a commanding officer, as the commander of the fighter force in an actual theater of combat. What were your experiences from Allied Force?
So let's talk about Operation Allied Force and context for the listeners. In the former Republic of Yugoslavia, to the Serbian population, the province of Kosovo was incredibly important to their history. And in that province of Kosovo, the Kosovar Albanian population, which was a majority, versus a Serbian minority. In all of former Republic of Yugoslavia, there had been lots of conflicts, but this one became the beginning of a genocide of the Serbs killing off Kosovar Albanians. NATO took a stance that said ultimately needed to do something about that, and it evolved into what became a 3-month air war, bombing of Kosovo, the Serbs in Kosovo, and then ultimately Serbia, to get them to stop. That's a really poor history of it, but essentially that's what it was. And Canada was part of the escalation of this operation. We'd sent in effectively a squadron. One had come back, another one had gone in, and then in the spring of 1999, this was really flaring up, and it was going to go into full-on combat. My squadron, in the rotation of operational Canadian F-18 squadrons, there were 4 of them at the time, and it was my squadron's turn in the spring of 1999 to be the lead squadron. And as this all turns out, we're going to go into Aviano Air Base on the northeast side of Italy, an hour north of Venice, an big American base, and we're going to take over from Squadron 425, which was a Bagotville, Quebec-based squadron. They're going to finish up, and we're going to roll in. And as it turns out, we show up 3 days before combat breaks out. And we start with 6 airplanes, but through 2 not intentional moves, we went from 6 to 8 to 12 and effectively had a wing of CF-18s fly through the combat of Operation Allied Force. So I ran the night war for the first 10 days or so, and then got fed in to be the squadron commander of this whole thing. And it's war. And I come from a peacetime Air Force. I come from a peacetime Air Force that wore blue flight suits and didn't have anything camouflage green at all. I got off the Airbus Canadian military transport in Aviano before the war started, and we all get off with the blue flight suits on in the squadron that was there ahead of us. And the squadron commander meets me. He's wearing U.S. military green flight suits, and these guys are going to war. And they're going to war 3 days later or 4 days later. And boy, we had to ramp up. I never bought into the peacetime attitude. My entire time as a squadron commander, I knew that my job was to have my squadron ready to go. I was blessed by given an amazing squadron by my predecessor who had prepared everything. And I had probably I think the most operationally focused CF-18 fighter pilot of the entire 40 years. His name was Jeff Beckett. He'd been part of the Desert Cats, which was the Canadian contingent that fought in Gulf War I. And he'd been a captain as a young fighter pilot. I had a long history with him, and he was a major in my squadron, and had groomed these guys when I took over. They were aggressive. They were keen to learn. They were arrogant. They were really, really front of the spear focused. And I took that as my introduction to a squadron, and I continued to build on that. I believed in leading from the front. I didn't believe in being a beacon counter, and I didn't believe in sitting back and let something else lead. I believed you had to fly. You had to show leadership from the front. And when I took over as a squadron commander, I took off my test pilot school badge. I started as a not combat ready. I had to become a wingman, combat ready, then a 2-ship lead, a 4-ship lead, and ultimately a mass attack lead. And I had to earn my way there. And my squadron were a great bunch of aviators. And we went into combat, and we went into combat as good as we could be with a whole bunch of handicaps. We didn't have night vision goggles, but it was going to be an all-day, all-night war. And we had limited experience with precision-guided munitions, which are laser-guided bombs, Vietnam-era technologies, but just then being introduced in the Canadian Air Force. But the entire Canadian fleet we were pretty good. We'd had the CF-18 got in the early 80s, and by now it's 99. So we're 15 plus years into our experience with the airplane, and we're pretty good. I mean, the fleet, we're pretty good F-18 guys. And we rolled in there, and in true Canadian fashion, we adapted, we were agile, and we just got on with the job. I was blessed with extraordinary ground crew. In that era, there had been a downsizing of the Air Force. And so the normal rank progression of technicians of ground crew had been stagnated. And I had corporals who should have been two ranks higher as sergeants, and master corporals who should have been two ranks higher as warrant officers. And the guys were incredibly experienced, guys and gals, incredibly talented and ferociously loyal to my squadron. So I had great ground crew, I had great air crew, and we went into war, and my attitude was, I came to win. And the second part is I need to bring everybody home. And anything else that wasn't operationally focused did not matter. And we went into it, into combat, adjusted quickly, figured things out, made mistakes. The first couple missions, each guy inevitably made mistakes, and then got in the groove. In the combat period, we flew essentially 700 sorties. That doesn't seem a lot, but we were weathered out for bad Italian spring weather for a lot of sorties. We were 2% of the force. We flew 10% of the missions. And of the missions we flew, 50% of them were led. That means we're the front guys deciding what to do. We're led by Canadians. That means that I led 60 to 70 aircraft mass attacks into Serbia, into Kosovo, to bomb them and to bring them all back. And that was an astonishing responsibility for, this relatively small Air Force. Our ground crew were, I never know the words to say it all. We had aircraft available 99.7% of the time. That is a production rate, a sortie rate that never, ever exists anywhere in peacetime. And yet our ground crew pulled that off. And they were miraculous. And they were miraculous because they were so experienced, because they were two rank levels below where they should have been. And they were fiercely loyal and productive. I'll tell some, and there's some fun stories of it. I had effectively people from 5 different units, so 4 operational squadrons plus the training squadron. And we're all proud of where we came from, whether we came from Cold Lake, Alberta, we came from Bagotville, Quebec, and we had English speakers and Quebec speakers. And I had a discontinuity in loyalty because everyone was loyal from where they came from, and I had to end that. And so I made everybody strip off their patches and get rid of their baseball caps. I had a really talented corporal who was a graphic artist, and we decided on a mascot. We decided we were like rats because we had to scrounge for everything, and also we had rats eating our computer cords in our buildings, so on base. So we thought that was an appropriate thing. We called ourselves the Balkan Rats. My graphic artist came up with this really gnarly rat head as our symbol. And we, in a very short period of time, we had T-shirts made up, we had ball caps made up, and we had patches to put on our shoulders. And we even painted the tail flashes of the CF-18 with the rat emblem. And all of a sudden, everybody was super proud to be part of the Balkan Rats. And you wanted to be not in Canada at home. You wanted to be in Aviano and be a Balkan Rat. And even today, people are proud that they were part of this unique unit. And when you came to Italy to join us, you weren't from Bagotville anymore, and you weren't from Cold Lake, you weren't from my squadron, you were a Balkan Rat. And so I created a loyalty. And it was maybe the one single thing I did well in that time period was make it very clear that we were all in this together. And then our job was, go, this will sound crass, but go bomb Serbia back into the Stone Age. And I actually paraphrase that from the commander of the U.S. commander of the air war, which was cripple them enough that it hurt so bad that the Serbs relinquished or capitulated or gave up and stopped the genocide that we were witnessing. It was a brilliant work of the aviators, incredible work by the ground crew. hugely risky and dangerous. We flew at night with no lights on. We didn't have night vision goggles because of the myopic uh, lack of vision of the Canadian Air Force, but my own failures too of not implementing night vision goggles. We flew at night. It's like driving down the 401 between Toronto and Ottawa or Toronto, Montreal. And, you and three of your friends are driving along, you turn off your headlights and you hope you don't run off the road or you don't hit each other. It was incredibly dangerous. And we did that for 3 months. We flew in all sorts of weather. We flew with, getting shot at, and we flew with equipment that was substandard against the surface air defenses that the Serbs had, because our defense systems were never focused on the environment that we flew at up at 20 and 25,000 feet. And yet we came out of it in a brilliant effort. So I take a lot from it in leadership. I take a lot from it in how to execute. I take none of it in the bean counting peacetime philosophy, how to manage people. This is about going to war, and this is about winning. And I kept that singularity in my focus throughout the entire conflict.
There's a couple of things there that stuck out to me. One is the importance of galvanizing a team together that came from disparate backgrounds. You Quebecois, Bagotville, French speakers, Anglophones, peacetime military, and then galvanizing them into a single team with a purpose under the Balkan Rats, which is just clearly so important to getting a team to perform together. And jealous that Beckett got to be both a Desert Cat and a Balkan Rat. That's pretty sweet. But you also, just reading between the lines, you did something throughout the discussion on Operation Allied Force that is what all the best bosses that I've ever seen do. And it's something that none of the bad bosses ever do. And that was, you praised all the people underneath you. And then you said, if there was anyone to blame for the NVGs, it's myself. So you're taking the blame, and then you're passing on the praise to everybody that worked underneath you, which I think is it's super important in a healthy leadership environment to share that praise. It costs leaders nothing to say that the people underneath them have done an excellent job, and yet it happens so rarely in so many places, not just in the military, but in the corporate environment as well. So maybe it's a good segue into having a discussion about how things can go poorly, what can lead to a toxic leadership or a toxic command environment, and how do you get out of that? And I think you've had experience there too, working within the F-35 test program. You have a blog about a particular leader in that environment that and you use the euphemism the Great Santini. And for those who haven't read the blog, maybe you can give a little bit of backstory into what made this environment so toxic, and how do you get, how does an organization recover from that environment?
Fun. Two things before I go. Ronald Reagan used to say, effectively paraphrasing, there's no limit to what you can achieve if you don't care who gets the credit. A great mentor of mine used to say that. And my philosophy on leadership and command is when you win, when things go well, everyone gets the credit. When things go bad, you take the blame. You, the leader, take the blame, period. And I was blessed in my world of extraordinary men and women that I worked with. And combat is a singular highlight of my entire career. I had the honor, truly the honor and the privilege of commanding great men and women in the harshest environment ever, and to win. And I'm enormously proud of every one of them. To this day, we are great friends and loyal to each other. And so here's my transition. And I come out of this world. I'm a squadron commander. Let's be really clear. I set the tone. The culture of my squadron is what I want it to be. It's the military world of this unique communication system we have, where I set the tone, right? I'm the commanding officer. This is how we're going to be in our squadron. This is how we're going to be in combat. And then I retired immediately and I joined the civilian world, and I was a train wreck. I'd come right out of combat. I'm just super aggressive. And I haven't even detoxed from it. And then I went to fly Eurofighter Typhoon in this 4-nation consortium. I'm a civilian now. I'm flying fighter jets, F4s, Tornadoes, and Eurofighter, but it's the civilian world, and it's so wildly different. And I'm in a different culture. I'm in Europe, and not aggressively American. It's not anti-war, but it's certainly not pro-war like I was post-combat or the American culture is. And so I'm not setting the norm anymore. I have to fit in. And then I transition, I come to North America. I joined Lockheed Martin, where I was for 17 years. And ultimately, I get to what I think is the graduation prize of all time, which is F-35. It's a franchise program. It's going to fly for 60 years now. It's going to fly 3 variants, and it's the big deal. It's 3,000 to 4,000 airplanes of 5th generation, and we're at the very beginning, and it's just the greatest test pilot job of all time. And I end up at Patuxent River, Maryland, where I'm talking from you now. We still have a home down here. I ping pong between Canada and the United States. And I'm posted there where the Navy and Marine Corps test their helicopters, tilt rotors, transport airplanes, and fighter jets. And I'm in this integrated test force of contractors, so Lockheed Martin, but other contractors, BAE, who contributed to the engine of the F-35 in the cockpit, Northrop Grumman, who built the radar, the array, and some of the sensors. And we're the civilian contractors, and we're mixed with the military guys and gals, engineers and program managers and pilots. We're all together. And it's a concept that was started at Edwards Air Force Base 30 plus years before. I'd been a part of it when I had been an F-16 pilot at Edwards a long time before. This notion of the people who build the article working together with the people that are buying it, so that you each have a better relationship and you know how things are developed, and there's no surprises for the customer. Each is helping each other develop a program. F-35 is the most complex aerospace vehicle ever designed, period. And it's a long test program, and it didn't go very good in the beginning. And anyone that knows anything about aviation has read about it. It was mired in controversy from the very beginning. It was overpromised and underdelivered, but also was technically colossally complex to make the technologies work like we promised. And in this world at Patuxent River, in this integrated test squadron, so this big building where everybody's working together, life's not good. Our short takeoff and vertical landing version, the F-35B, is not really working. And so we're getting lots of flack from the military and the government because things aren't good. The pressure's on from the contract from our side because we got to deliver. Pressure's on the engineers and the pilots. The military is really upset because things aren't working. And we had a United States Marine Corps colonel who was sort of linked to our squadron, but thought he owned what we were doing. And he really didn't like us. He'd spent his whole time in the military and never really been around civilians. And this notion of civilians and the military together didn't know how to make that work. And at one point, it peaked where one of my Lockheed Martin test pilot colleagues told a couple of Marine Corps lieutenant colonel test pilots that our whole organization was dysfunctional. And the Marine Corps lieutenant colonels went and told the Marine Corps full colonel what my colleague had said, and the colonel went postal, lost it, and kicked a hole in the wall of the hallway where we all worked. And it really represented to us how massive our toxicity was in our organization, that we couldn't identify problems, we couldn't communicate. And in my mind, we were going to have an accident. Everybody was so worried about the senior military people and even the senior leadership at Lockheed Martin screaming at everybody to make things work, as if yelling louder was going to make it work better. And we were going to have an accident. Somebody was going to make a mistake. And all the contributors, which you know so very well, all the contributors that would make an accident happen were lining up. And so you mentioned The Great Santini. It's a book by Tim Conroy. I'll say in 1976. It was printed in 1979. Robert Duvall starred in the movie. It's about a Marine Corps lieutenant colonel, fighter pilot. He's an alcoholic, a raging alcoholic, violent at home, but he's a super good pilot, which I actually linked to my own father and the childhood that I had, which is why I mention Santini often. And I'm My father was a Canadian version of Santini, so I grew up in a world of abusiveness. And this Marine Corps colonel represented to me the entire Santini persona that I'd grown up with. He was a just aggressively violent in his disposition at work, and it was the contributor that was going to lead to this toxic environment. So here you have a $1 trillion development program, multi-million dollar prototype airplanes. An F-35C in the beginning cost $250 million for the initial prototypes. Enormously expensive. Every time you flew, it was $1 million of overhead and assets to support a flight. And we're not getting along. And we're going to crash an airplane. And it couldn't be more toxic. We're fighter pilots with all the same background. I'm retired, and we're all retired lieutenant colonels. We're working with these Marine Corps majors and lieutenant colonels and United States Navy commanders and lieutenant commanders. And we all have come from the same background. We're just a little older, but same world. And yet we're not getting along. And in a world where trust is absolute to ensure that we can fly safely every day in a very high risk, dangerous world of flight test, we had none of that. It ultimately comes that, so I'll finish the story by saying, I texted a classmate from test pilot school, a Navy two-star admiral who was a mentor to the Marine Corps colonel. And I texted my classmate and said, hey, buddy, when you get home on Friday, we need to have a beer because we need to talk about this so we can diffuse this. And my classmate, in a very short-sighted, poor way to manage things, he picked up the phone and called this Marine Corps colonel and said, like, what did you just do? And the Marine Corps colonel goes, well, who told you that? And my classmate goes, well, Billie Flynn did. And that was it. The Marine Corps colonel finishes the phone call with the two-star admiral. He calls my VP, my vice president at Lockheed Martin, and that vice president races down the hall, walks into my office and goes, you get out of this building now, and summarily kicked me out. And what it led to was a 2.5-year exile from that test force. I was flying F-35 and my career was going on, but you took me out of the equation as if I was going to solve the toxic problem of the place and the colonel. In the end, I tell the story that I think removing me was taking the fuse from the bomb. It's because now the Marine Corps colonel knew that a two-star admiral was looking at him. He knew that his career was in real trouble, and he really toned things down and backed off. And we took away the lighting of the bomb, the fuse that would have ignited everything, and it all worked out. And when I came back, I was working F-35 throughout all this, but when I came back, it was a much different world. And I'll finish this story by saying my years at Pax River and what we did, firing missiles, dropping bombs, and finishing the testing of F-35 and incredibly high risk, dangerous flight test, was extraordinarily successful. And the men and women that I flew with, the men and women I worked with, the men I flew with, today we are all incredibly close because we lived the enormous success of F-35, every one of us contributing to making the airplane. It is so dominant, so lethal in the world today. And we turned it all around. And we turned it all around because we trusted each other, we respected each other, we became friends at work and away from work, and we knew we could rely on each other, which had been entirely missing in the lead up to what I called the hole in the wall gang scenario.
Yeah, you became a bit of a sacrificial lamb, and that you brought some heat and light to the conduct of the Marine Corps colonel, but at a cost to yourself. Doesn't seem like there was a ton of root cause analysis done by the organization on what the actual root of the problem
I struggle with it, right? So I was an abused kid, and I was used to getting yelled at, and so I have a real thick skin for that. And I think that is what helped me react the way I did. I wasn't being a whistleblower. I was calling my classmate going, hey, we need to defuse this. And when I was exiled, as I call it, I didn't fall apart, and I didn't go file some lawsuit against anybody because I wanted the program to succeed. Because I came for this program of F-35, and I wanted to help turn things around. And so I just kind of took it in stride and persisted and stayed long enough until I returned back to the same place and the same desk and back in my house, and moved on, and left it all behind and used it as a lesson. So a bit of a sacrificial lamb, but in a positive sense, helped turn things around. And my last years in F-35, as I created the air show, and I was the global spokesman, and clearly the program was really good to me, and I think I contributed to the program. So it's sort of water under the bridge now. But an important lesson of toxic nature. Remember, I said I was the commanding officer of a fighter squadron and a wing in combat. I set the tone. I was the equivalent of that colonel. And then, in the stages to going to Europe, where it's socialism, and then into this military environment at Patuxent River, it's such a transformation from you're the guy in charge to you're nothing. You're just another peg, in the wall, or a cog in the wheel, and it's just so interesting to go through those different stages.
Um, how do you think an organization, because in this case you were the catalyst for change, but not every organization is lucky enough to have a Billie Flynn. And some organizations, some units, some squadrons can go through year upon year of toxic environment without anybody standing up. Is there I don't know, some lessons learned from your career, both from a leadership standpoint and from a followership standpoint, where you're one of the line flyers or the gears of the operation, where you can identify when things are going down the wrong path, and there's a way to, get the train back on the rails, or chart a new course without necessarily needing to go to a drastic case? Or is it just that when an organization gets to a certain point and it's so toxic, it needs a massive event in order to steer it back towards a healthy and productive
TK, I
environment?
think you know some of that answer already, because some organizations you just can't fix. If you look at the Gulfstream company that had a horrible flight test accident that killed 3 flight testers now a number of years ago, post-accident, they really had to go change the entire culture of their flying organization, because they'd hid the bad culture and tried to rebuild on it. And so sometimes it takes those drastic measures. And for some people, we tell people in the civilian and military world, if your world's so toxic, then you need to leave and move away and go on, because there'll be a place that will recognize you and appreciate you. I don't think, and I understand all of that, and I believe in all of that, but I don't think you can always walk away from things. I had 4 squadron commanders on my first 5 years in the CF-18 world. So I saw a pretty good spread right off the bat. And not all my commanders over the years were great. There were great ones around, but they weren't always my squadron commander. And for those civilians there, you might not get this, but a unit in the military, a squadron, I always say a squadron is a place and a time. It may have a great history, but you may show up in the toxic years when it's just in the dumps and the leadership's bad and there's no culture and there's no camaraderie, and things just aren't working well. And there's other times you show up. I was blessed to inherit a squadron that was in a great place, and it was the right place to be. And it was a King Kong squadron in that period of time. So squadron's a place and a time, a unit, a workplace is a place and a time. How do we contribute when we're not the guy in charge, the guy and gal in charge? And do we fall on our sword and sacrifice ourselves to make things better? I think there's a place for falling on your sword. I did it once. I did it a bunch of times, but I did it in that particular case that we talked about. But I don't think you can do that every time. And when you're faced with an organization that isn't working, that isn't toxic, I do think that if you want to stay in that world, then you can work to help things change. And it may not mean that you're going to change your boss or the bosses above you. And it may mean what you need to do is adapt to the environment and use different techniques. And one of the things I learned in Eurofighter Typhoon where I was a minority player as a foreigner, especially in Germany, not treated as one of the norm, is I learned about collaboration. And what I mean by that is when I found out something that I knew needed to be changed, then instead of my voice being the only one, I educated and exposed my colleagues to the same problem I was trying to fix, the same issue I was trying to address. And all of a sudden, a voice of one became a voice of three, and then it became a voice of five, and then it became a voice of 15. At some point, it wasn't just one test pilot, it was all the German test pilots. And then in the four nations, all of a sudden, it was all the Eurofighter test pilots. And then we were able to affect change. Because it isn't just toxic things that will prevent you from making things better. In a company, there's a bottom line and there's a stock price and there's financial imperatives, or there's timing and program imperatives that drive timelines that won't allow things to change the way we think we might. So I certainly learned in Eurofighter, and I'm about to release a blog on that about collaboration. You can be right, but you're voicing what you found out to be you thought was correct may ultimately land with the wrong consequences. So you can be right, but what you see is the wrong consequences. And so in the examples that we're talking about, collaboration is a tool that will allow us to go from being the sacrificial lamb to one of many voices trying to help affect change. And then I think you can help change a culture in a unit. And then I think you can help make some product better. And then I think you can help make your company more effective, more profitable. I think just taking yourself out of the equation and making it more about a bunch of you is a unique way to do that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if what your thoughts were on the role of humility and accountability and leadership is, but I think you just
No, let's come
answered
back to that because you know this, because you know it from the United States Fighter Weapons School or Weapons Instructor Course, WIC. We used to call it in Canada, but it's called the WIC in the United States now. And what do they teach graduates? The U.S. Air Force version of Top Gun: humility, approachability, and credibility. So imagine that, the Tom Cruise equivalent in the United States Air Force is this King Kong male or female fighter pilot that comes back from this school and they know everything about the F-22 Raptor or the F-35 or the F-16. And their effectiveness when they get back into the population of their squadron and the people they fly with and on their Air Force base is how humble they are, how approachable they are, how credible they are. That's how they get their message across. That's how they affect change, not coming back and pounding their fist on the table, telling everyone that they're the smartest guy or gal in the room. It's being credible and gaining the respect because people can come talk to you and being humble enough to approach people and not have an ego step in the way. And I think those three traits really carry into the civilian world, also in everything that we do.
Yeah. I mean, the credibility comes earning the patch. It's hard earned. And then if you're approachable and humble, you're going to get people asking you questions and they know that you're not stingy with instruction and then everybody you're the rising tide that lifts all ships.
So one of the things I think about a lot now and I work on, I think I've come to this supported by some programs, especially in the United States, is human performance. And specifically in aviation, but really it probably applies differently. And I'm going to jump ahead and say, look, the term we use or I use is called the tactical athlete. And I approach now flying an airplane like we approach doing sports. And because, well, a couple of things. Chuck Yeager, first man to go supersonic, as a 24-year-old, used to say that to be a good pilot comprises three things: some natural ability, training, and experience. And I've learned over the years that natural ability gets flushed out pretty quickly. It's about your training and experience. And when I look at people flying and how they do, I've learned over the years there's a whole bunch of weaknesses and contaminants that contribute to bad performances or poor performances. And in the United States Air Force has recognized this. There are two programs, one in the training system, one in the operational world, that focus on optimizing the human weapons system is the name of one of the terms. It's making the human better in when they fly, better performance. And it's focusing on the physical elements, the mental elements, and the physiological elements of flying. And I apply it to the fifth gen world of F-35. Look, in fighter jets in an F-18 or an F-16, we flew for 1.5 hours. And you could go up there, fly around, you do some dogfighting for ultimately not very minutes actually of a flight, or go drop bombs or practice some tactical mission, come back and land. And we can all make it through that. Most of us can. But when I dissect missions for the F-35, which carries a lot more gas, I look at missions in the Arctic, which Canada is going to, when it introduces F-35, have to patrol more in the Arctic than ever before. In the United States, the threat to the United States is China, which involves the term tyranny of distance, incredibly long hours that the American forces will have to transit to fly to fight a Chinese threat. And then after fighting, they're going to have to transit all the way back home. That's a tremendous number of hours in an airplane. And I start to think about how to keep the human performing at their peak. And oh, by the way, if we look at the Chinese threat, we're going to be outnumbered 4-1. And even if I'm super lethal in my F-35, I got to be like science fiction, amazingly good to be outnumbered that much and survive every single time. And so I started approaching how to manage the human better when they fly. And I approach it now like a sport. So if you think of Tom Brady, those who like or don't like him in American football, playing on a Sunday afternoon, or LeBron James in basketball, or pick at Jaromir Jagr, who had this extraordinary career as a hockey player. How do you, let's pick the American football example. You're going to play Sunday afternoon. How do you back up and be ready for that Sunday afternoon flight? And it turns out you back up until Monday morning, the week prior, and you work a whole week of 6 or 7 days to be ready for a single event. And how do you make sure you're ready for that single event? And when you're flying, how do you make sure you're ready for a singular event, whether it's a 10-hour mission, or in my case, as a test pilot, a 5-hour sortie of an F-35 out over the Atlantic Ocean? How do I make sure I'm ready at the very end of it? So my body's ready, my mentally ready, I'm physically, I still am as alert as ever and capable as ever. I still have the capacity to fight off the G, so I don't succumb to G-induced loss of consciousness. I'm mentally as alert as possible right at the very end. And how do I do that? And I back it all that up into how I train now, and how I do simulators, and how I practice, and how I eat, by the way, not Fruit Loops with in the morning, or my kids, just to aggravate me, eat Pop-Tarts in front of me just to get me going in the morning. They don't eat bad American food. And so how do I eat properly? How do I hydrate properly now, so that I'm hydrated at the end of a 5-hour test mission or a 10-hour mission out over towards China? How do I manage that? And then how do I make sure I'm not hurt? I haven't pulled a back muscle dogfighting because I wasn't in shape. So how do I fit fitness in there, or rehab with massage therapy, or therapists, or rehab, or physio people to help me get back? All of that drives us into a state of appreciating that flying airplanes and flying vehicles is different than we have in the past, and how we focus on the peak performance. Remember, we talked about that, how to make sure that I'm ready for that every time. I probably lived a life like that. I just didn't know the term or the thesis that goes with it. And that's a big focus that I wish we could introduce more, and we'll have to introduce for F-35. $80 million US for an F-35 is more than 100 million Canadian. And those are national assets. Those are strategic assets, not tactical fighters anymore. And we'll want every man and woman that goes near those airplanes to be their absolute peak every single time that they go fly. And that's a massive shift in how we treat the pilot. So there's my introduction, my 3-minute introduction.
So, I mean, from a physical preparation perspective, I think, especially a lot of young people, when you're young and fit, you're probably playing sports, you're hitting the gym. Maybe nowadays you're eating a little bit healthier. Um, and we know a little bit about fatigue and its, deleterious effects on performance. You fly without sleep, you're essentially flying drunk. Um, but when you're talking about the amount of data that the human is subjected to just through the headset on the F-35 alone, um, the mental fatigue must be equal to or worse than the physical fatigue. And how do you prepare these young women and men who are stepping into it for the first time, who are going from whatever the 4.5 gen trainer is into this environment, longer missions, probably more complex mission sets, a lot more data. Maybe they're physically fit, maybe they're well rested, but how do they expand their capacity to stay at the peak mental performance for 5 or 10 hours?
How do you do that? How do you stay so focused? Look, here in Maryland for 6 months of the year, I wore a dry suit underneath my G suit and my jacket that I wore in F-35 because the limit here is 55 degrees Fahrenheit out over the Atlantic Ocean or the Chesapeake Bay. And 6 months of the year, we wore dry suits. So it's like going to Weight Watchers or some diet program every day you fly, contributing to the fatigue you're going through, right? Dehydrating yourself. And how do you stay focused? And for most people, especially when you're young, you think, I'll go up and I'll fake it. And they don't realize they get fatigued over time. And in my world, and I've seen it even in the operational world, some of the worst things have happened at the end of missions. At the end of a 10-hour ferry mission to Finland, two of my colleagues ran into near catastrophic events and had to fight to get their airplanes on the ground. And it was at the end of it all. So how do you say to yourself, 10 hours from now, all hell's going to break loose? How do I make sure I'm ready for that? And understanding all the cumulative fatigue to your body and to your mental acuity over time. How do you keep someone super sharp in a fight in an F-35 when they go against, let's pick some hypothetical scenario, but you ferry from someplace, okay, pick Ukraine, because we'll say you have to fly 3 hours from some land to get into an environment like that. It's the highest threat environment ever, the equivalent of World War III, of everyone shooting at you. You have to be super focused to manage everything, to stay alive, execute your mission, kill the bad guys, and then fly all the way home. How do you do that for hours upon hours on end? How do you train someone from the very beginning of their flying career to understand that they have to develop the mental acuity, the stamina to be able to manage this, not just for an hour anymore, but for 7 hours? And it's the mental fatigue, right? This is not just some simple PlayStation, Xbox controller. This is the most sophisticated video game in history, and real people are shooting at you. And so I think it's a huge task to try to even start to think of how we manage the men and women that we're going to put in these vehicles moving forward.
I talked on another podcast to a physician in Australia, Dr. Bill Bestick. He was an ex-SAS operator, um, and turned pilot, turned anesthesiologist. So three pretty incredible careers. And he took from his military and flying background the holes in the cheese approach. And when he was thinking about fatigue in his practice as a physician, often they do their back to back to back to back, triple double shifts because they're the only physician available, and the culture around a healthcare professional being awake for 24 hours, it's still for some reason acceptable, even though we know from the medical literature that you're very compromised cognitively. And so he said, knowing that, having the aviation background, there's only so much you can do to suggest that you shouldn't be operating. And at a certain point, you still have to do it. So he said, one of the layers that he would try and put in there, he's surrounded by a team. He'd say, look, I haven't slept in this many hours, this many days. We've got some patients coming in. One of them has a very specific allergy to a medication that we're going to give to all of the other patients. So when that person comes in, I want somebody to alert me. And really using the team around him to try and insulate him against a potential error. So putting a preventative measure in right at the beginning. And you can do that to an extent in aviation if you're in a crew environment. Maybe you turn to the first officer, hey, I slept in so long, and so you're going to follow me through on every checklist, all of the challenge and response items we need to be super clear on. When you're a single pilot at an F-35, especially on a lengthy trip like that, you are the last check and balance on yourself. Are there, is there a different portion of training to prepare people for the very different environment in which your fifth gen fighter pilot is now going to operate?
I'll say no, but I'll tell you that I had the wisdom of all the years of flying that helped me when I flew F-35. And what I what I focused on as an F-35 test pilot was they were long duration missions. They were the envelope expansion, the high speed Mach 1.6, 700 knots in the F-35C and 1.6 Mach 630 knots in the F-35B, all the high speed stuff, all the supersonic missile shoots. It was high speed, it was aggressive, and it was just cripplingly fatiguing. Oh, by the way, wearing a dry suit on there, and you're up there for 5 hours, and then you got to come home. And I'm just going to, so I think I was a bit like the Yarmir Yager view of it all. I controlled every part of the day that I could. And my day always started, for me, I'm a bike rider. So at 5 in the morning, I'm up and I'm on my bike and I ride for, 30 kilometers and I'm getting my head straight. And it's my version of meditation. And then I'm very specific of how I eat. And it's a whole routine before I show up to my simulator to practice, to then walk out of the simulator, then to know exactly what I'm eating, to go into the jet, to then go fly a 5-hour mission. And I'm hydrating while I'm out there because I can't afford to get behind in hydration, to then be ready for chaos to happen. And so I think I was a bit like the Yarmir Yager. I learned to adopt the habits. How do you teach someone that's young, that thinks they're immortal and invincible, to be like that? I think you have to start early, and it's hard though, and to impress on someone that the first hour doesn't matter, that bad things are going to happen at 4.5 hours, and you're 32 years old and you need to start thinking more like someone a lot more experienced, even though this hasn't scared you yet. When you get older, you've been scared enough times that it's a survival thing. You've learned to adapt. I will tell you, we really hurt ourselves, even though we should be smart enough. And one of the things we do in airplanes, and I know you did it too, is we don't drink in an airplane because we don't want to have to pee in an airplane. And I talk about this a lot. I get laughed at by my peers and people that listen to me, and it's a thing. It's a real thing. We tactically dehydrate. In the F-18 fleet, and it's been going on for 40 years, we'd stop drinking coffee an hour before flight because we'd go to the bathroom just before we flew. And because when we flew, we didn't want to have to go to the bathroom because that meant this very awkward task of safing up our ejection seat, unstrapping from the ejection seat, peeing in a essentially it's a plastic freezer bag with sponge or powder in it, and then putting that away, getting strapped back in, and then arming our ejection seat and carrying on with the flight. And if you're a woman, there's no way to do that. So you probably have to wear a diaper. It's not very elegant. And so the cheat for that is for more than 40 years. So my whole career, and probably even my father's career, we just stopped drinking. And that's like it's like going to the gym and not taking water with you. It's like playing soccer or climbing a 10,000-foot mountain and not taking water with you, or going to the soccer field, playing a whole soccer game and not drinking anything. And it's insane. And oh, by the way, as we dehydrate ourselves, we tactically dehydrate, our body starts to fall apart. We lose our G tolerance, our mental acuity starts to fade away. We become wet noodles out there. And we don't realize that even though we've worked out and we're healthy and we've eaten well, what we've done is completely contaminate and sacrifice ourselves. And it's astonishing that we haven't figured that out yet either in all of this equation. And I know it's a little goofy to talk about it, but all of it fits under the umbrella of making the human more aware of themselves and trying to stave off the onset of fatigue, just like in a physician's case, not as extreme like that, but in a sense, $100 million airplanes. B-21 is going to fly the bomber in the United States. That's what, $500 million, $300 million. That's a lot of hardware in the hands of a man or woman, and you want them to peak perform every single time you're out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Billy, we're coming up on the end of our time here available, which is a shame because I have another 100 questions to ask. I do hope that we can speak again because there's a lot more you have to share and a lot more questions that I have to ask you. But I really appreciate you joining us for the podcast today. I hope to have you on again in the future soon, and I wish you all the best. Please do keep in touch.
Okay, thanks for the invite. Thanks for entertaining the conversations today. I really appreciate what you're trying to do. And it's because I think we've all thought how important this is on the aviation side, especially, but we can appreciate the link in the medical world. And no one's been able to accomplish it yet. So you're embarking on a path that is not paved before you. So I wish you the best of luck, and thanks for hosting me today.
It is a dark and winding road. As to quote somebody else, it's like chewing on glass while staring into an abyss, but we'll get there. Thanks, Billy. Cheers.